مجزرة في مدينة جسرين.
166 died in Syria until this moment, and the regime forces commit massacres in Damascus, Aleppo, and Homs. A new military formation called the People's Resistance Group is formed, and the Freedom Army takes over Deir ez-Zor. The Medical Committee of Damascus demands the halt of the execution of Abdel Qadir al-Jazairi, and activists demand to free the journalist Mazen Darwish. Welcome to Orient TV English News Bulletin. The local coordinating committee said that the death toll in Syria reached today 166 victims. Until this moment, most of them fell in Damascus and its suburbs, where the regime forces carried out a campaign of raids and arrests in the neighborhood of Al-Qazzaz in Damascus. Meanwhile, the regime forces proceeded to set up several checkpoints since early morning hours around the neighborhood of Al-Tadamun. Also, the neighborhoods of Al-Muhajirin, Rukn al-Din, Al-Salihiyya, and Al-Shaghur witnessed wide military and security campaigns, in addition to arbitrary raids and arrests of hundreds amid heavy shooting on passers-by.
مشرق ركن الدين الاثنين 6/8/2012.
Al-Assad regime forces committed a new massacre in the town of Jisrin and Kafar Batna and in the city of Al-Mu'addamiyya and Damascus suburbs, where several were killed and wounded amid the complete interruption of all means of communication and a complete siege. And according to activists, several people fell dead and wounded, in addition to destroying many houses due to the missile strikes on the towns of Sayyida Zainab, Al-Diyabiyya, and Hijr al-Balad in Damascus suburbs, at a time where dozens from a single family were wounded in the city of Harasta due to the fall of a shell on their house on Al-Utstrad area.
Those artillery shells are directed towards the Syrians who dared to demand the freedom they were denied for years under a regime that obviously doesn't know anything about politics except killing and destruction. The regime forces, in the midst of the military escalation on the cities of the capital's suburbs, have invaded Al-Sayyida Zainab, Al-Diyabiyya, Hujaira, and Al-Buwaida, using heavy tanks and targeting homes of innocent people and terrorizing them. Barbaric bombing took its toll in Arbin, Kafr Batna, and many other villages in Damascus suburbs, amid the tight siege that was imposed a few days ago, where the regime has stepped up its campaign against the civilians along with heavy security deployment. The tragic situation has caused a huge displacement among the residents as the living and health conditions deteriorate. But the Damascens are holding on to the revolution, determined to withstand the challenge and bring down the Assad regime.
And for more updates regarding the developments in the capital Damascus and its suburbs, we speak to Suzanne Ahmad, the spokeswoman for the Revolutionary Command Council from Damascus. Suzanne, welcome into this bulletin. First of all, I want to ask you about the new massacre in Jisrin in Damascus suburbs and other massacres in other areas. What are the details of these massacres, and where are the focus of the military operations?
Good evening. Actually, massacres are still going on in Damascus suburbs and in Damascus. As you've just mentioned, Jisrin and Muaddamiyya actually witnessed horrible massacres where dozens of people were found killed, deformed, handcuffed, and sometimes even burnt. We were not able actually to identify those people because they were deformed badly. people are just getting killed for no reason. We just got to know that now. Before a few hours, people were going by the bus, so they stopped at the checkpoint when two of the Assad's forces asked them to get off the bus and just executed them in front of everybody for no reason. We don't know why and for what. What did they do? In other areas, my lady, there are still many military operations going on. Like early in the morning, Jober was being shelled with rockets and mortar shells. Even in Ash-Shaghur, Assad's forces stormed into Ash-Shaghur this morning and arrested young men randomly. We got to know about a very horrible, actually, horrible accident that happened in Rukn al-Din, where one of the Shabiha tightened a man at home and burned this fire to the house.
Yes.
Prevented people from helping that person and from just extinguishing that fire.
Yes.
Till that person died.
So Susan, I can understand from what you're saying that people are being killed randomly, and also shelling is targeting different areas in Damascus and its suburbs. What about medical or humanitarian aid? Can you reach those in need of those of this aid, or are the areas besieged?
Actually, these hot areas most of the time are besieged. This is one thing. The other thing is when people are down, for example, they are killed or just wounded, you can't reach them. You can't give them help simply because there is still continual random shelling, or snipers are shooting madly at every moving thing. That's why it's really difficult, and some people really died just because they couldn't get help on the street due to snipers or due to shelling.
Yes.
Another thing is that there is a dire need for medical equipment and medical substances. We can't actually afford medical equipment and medical substances to these hot areas. Doctors are not really available because they target doctors and those people who give help to the wounded and to activists.
Yes, thank you very much, Susan Ahmad, the spokeswoman of the Revolutionary Command Council, speaking to us from Damascus. The Doctors Damascus Coordinating Committee has called for the stop of the implementation of the death sentence against Dr. Khaldoun al-Jazairi, who was arrested in front of his house 2 months ago, and the news of his death sentence was leaked. It's worth mentioning that Dr. al-Jazairi is an important dentist, and he has done many researches and studies, and Dr. Jazairi also suffers from poor health conditions and needs medical monitoring and medication on a daily basis. Activists also appealed to civil organizations and international community to intervene for the release of the artist and activist Kifa Ali Deeb and the activist Rami Hnawi, who were arrested yesterday in Sahnaya in Damascus suburbs. The activists in Sahnaya said that there are fears from the militia of causing serious injuries to the detainees. And it's worth mentioning that Kifa Ali Deeb, a member of the Syrian Democratic Forum. Meanwhile, the Freedom and Protection Center for Journalists has renewed its demands for the immediate release of a journalist, Mazen Darwish, head of the Syrian Center for Media and Freedom of Expression, and it held the Syrian regime responsible for his safety, urging the international community to intensify pressure in order to secure the release of Darwish and all freedom of expression prisoners. The call comes after the local coordination committees in Syria learned that a letter from their intelligence was given to the military court in Damascus, stating that the journalist Mazen Darwish is to be referred to a special military court secretly, and where he will be deprived from the right of having a counsel. It is also worth mentioning that Mazen Darwish, a journalist and the director of the Syrian Center for Media and Freedom of Expression, is one of the most prominent activists of the Syrian Revolution, who was arrested on the 12th of February by the Air Intelligence, along with a number of staff from the center who have been released earlier, whereas the fate of the journalist Mazen Darwish remains unknown. Moving on to Aleppo province, where bombing from helicopters continued on the neighborhoods of Hanano, Salah ad-Din, and Al-Sha'ar, Bab al-Hadid, and Aqyul, and the city of Tel Rifat, which led to the fall of several victims, dead and wounded, amid distress calls from parents in the light of the continued siege and bad humanitarian situation and complete lack of medicines and medical staff to treat the injured. Meanwhile, activists broadcasted pictures yesterday of a massacre committed by the regime forces against detainees in their intelligence in Aleppo, which killed at least 10 detainees who were shot while they were handcuffed. To that, the Syrian Network for Human Rights documented the fall of 224 victims yesterday, including 28 children. In Hama, the villages of Mount Shahshabo witnessed violent bombing. The shelling also reached the towns of Murig and Jurjus and the villages of Sahl al-Ghab amid campaigns of raids and arrests and a large displacement movement of people in these villages. Meanwhile, a huge explosion rocked Salmiya city, which led to the fall of several dead and wounded, while the city of Hama is still suffering under a severe blockade. Syrian hospitals face a severe shortage of medicine and pharmaceutical products, threatening the lives of Syrians with chronic diseases and victims of the ongoing fighting, the World Health Organization said today. The organization added that 90% of Syria's medicine was being produced inside the country before the crisis broke out, and that many medical plants, mostly centered around rural Aleppo, Damascus, and Homs, have been closed down.
Many hospitals and health centers have been closed, damaged or controlled by one of the parties to the conflict. Often these health facilities that are still open are inaccessible due to ongoing violence and lack of public transportation. They are not even, because of the increased cost of fuel, even taxis are not apparently running a lot, so people simply can't go to hospitals even if those hospitals are open.
A division of the Syrian Freedom Army declared a new military formation called the People's Resistance Group, which engulfs 40 battalions of the soldiers and officers who defected from al-Assad's regime army. Sources from the division also told Orient News reporter that this new formation may contain up to 45 different battalions spread out through all of Damascus, Hama, Idlib, Aleppo, and Latakia.
The new formation seems to be working within the brigade of the Syrian Freedom Army operating on the war grounds, disregarding any problems from the external Syrian opposition and military officers. The military deciding division of the Syrian Freedom Army also issued a statement to the members of the Syrian Freedom Army who are currently outside of Syria, inviting them to return back into Syria and engage in the battles and live warfare against the Assad regime. In addition, the statement also directed words to the defected officers and soldiers who are sitting in the refugee camps and consider themselves members of the Syrian Freedom Army, that the Syrian revolution is inside of Syria and not outside, and that the Syrian people are in need of their presence in Syria to protect them, as much as the rebels need their military experience. Furthermore, the issued statement also affirmed that whomever fails to come into Syria or finds himself incompetent for the assigned task, then he must declare his resignation from the army and consider himself a regular Syrian civilian. It also added that whoever refuses the military directions of the statement will be trialed through the revolutionary court system and charged with the accusation of abandoning his military duty of protecting the country and its people. These military instructions were issued by the rebels and defected military personnel who make up the Syrian Freedom Army on the internal side of the Syrian border. These individuals, after calling upon the Syrian Freedom Army members on the outside, stated that it is the rebels who decide the attack and retreat against the Assad regime forces, declaring the freed Syrian territories and the initiation of 0 hour. The reporting sources also added that a high-ranked officer who will be declaring his defection from the Assad regime army soon will be leading this division, as he will be assisted by the military council without any external sectarian involvement. Meanwhile, those military individuals already in Syria have pledged alliance to the laws of the Syrian Freedom Army as well as to protect the Syrian people as long as they live.
And coming up later in the bulletin, Syrian refugees suffer catastrophic humanitarian conditions. Welcome back. You're watching Orient TV English News Bulletin. The city of Ariha in Idlib suburbs witnessed a massacre that was committed by the regime forces. This massacre led to the death of at least 7 civilians and injured dozens who are in critical conditions. Meanwhile, the cities of Kafr Nubbal and Ma'arat al-Nu'man were subjected to a heavy artillery bombardment and heavy clashes between the government forces and the Syrian Freedom Army in Jisr al-Shughur. Furthermore, activists stated that over 50 tanks reached the barrier of Al-Masara and that the Rouj Valley was subjected to heavy bombardment amid the disconnection of electricity and the displacement of citizens.
Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar.
And for more updates regarding the developments in Idlib and its suburbs, we speak to Nuruddin Rehawi, member of the Revolutionary Command Council from Idlib. Nuruddin, welcome to our news. First of all, can you tell us more about the situation in Idlib in light of the massacre that was committed today in Ariha?
Yes, good evening. Actually, can you hear me, please?
Yes, Nuruddin, good evening. We can hear you well.
Yes, good. Actually, for the last 6 days, Ariha was under heavy random bombardment as a punishment.
Yes.
Which resulted to the following. We had 45 martyrs and 200 wounded, dozens of collapsed houses. Actually, on the other hand, we have a huge refuge movements. And on the other hand, we are out of any kind of medical supplies.
Yes.
Beside the Assad troops, they bombard and targeted the hospitals in Ariha. So we have 2 main hospitals has been bombarded.
Yes.
We ask all and every humanitarian agencies for all kind of humanitarian and medical support in Ariha. I would like also to add that the locals had to bury their martyrs in the Central Public Garden because they were attacked at the graveyard by the Assad troops. So we have a very miserable and catastrophic situation, either economic situation, social situation, military situation. Nevertheless, we are under siege since long time.
Nuruddin, today in the latest updates today, Ma'arat al-Nu'man and Kafr Nubbal witnessed heavy shelling. Can you please brief us on the situation now?
Yes, actually, what we understand that most of the cities that are located on the highway from Damascus and from Latakia, they were under heavy shelling and bombardment.
Yeah.
Because they were attacking, the Free Army there was attacking the convoys, tank convoys that are going to Aleppo to support Assad troops for their campaign. That's why most of the cities and most of the villages that are located on the highway was, as a punishment, they were under heavy bombardment.
Also because of the presence of the Free Syrian Army. Nuruddin Rehawi, member of the Revolutionary Command Council, thank you for being with us, and this is the only time we have. The cities and towns of Dar'a witnessed heavy artillery bombardment that started since the early morning hours, where activists stated that several houses were damaged, which was followed by heavy gunfire that took place in public roads in the town of Ghabaghab. Meanwhile, the towns of Khirbat Ghazali and Al-Ajmi and Da'al witnessed heavy bombing that was launched from the security barriers that are spread all over the towns.
Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar.
This camera is shaking due to the fall of a shell near the cameraman. But he soon regains his firmness and determination to continue monitoring and documenting each crime by the Assad regime in his hometown in Dar'a. The situation in the city isn't better than the situation in other towns in Hauran, where the acts of violence and destruction continue amid heavy and fierce clashes between the Free Syrian Army and the regime troops. The most recent of these clashes took place in the town of Tel Shab, where the government forces chased a group of civilians who were trying to flee to Jordan in search of a sanctuary. Other cities, such as Al-Hirak, were bombed by mortars and rockets and are still under siege, lacking all the necessities of life. And the same scenario is repeated in the towns of Khirb al-Ghazali, Da'il, and Busr al-Harir, while other towns saw a huge surge of splits among the regime troops, which resulted in even more violent clashes as the regime soldiers tried to hunt down the dissidents to punish them for choosing freedom. But despite all kinds of violence used by the Assad regime, protests continue to demonstrate the people's refusal to surrender to terror and their ongoing yearning for freedom and the overthrow of the regime.
A child was killed and dozens were injured due to artillery, tank and mortar shelling on the city of Al-Qasir in Homs. Meanwhile, artillery bombardment also targeted the neighborhoods of Deir Ba'alba and Al-Wa'ar, which later reached the cities of Tel Bise, Al-Rastan and Tel Kalakh, amid heavy gunfire and big displacement of citizens who ran away to neighboring areas, afraid of the regime's robbing and capturing campaigns that are being carried out daily. And coming up in the bulletin, Syrian refugees suffer catastrophic humanitarian conditions. The Syrian Human Rights Network has documented the number of killed victims in Syria within the month of July, which they said has the bloodiest month since the beginning of the uprising. More details in the following report.
The death toll reached 3,643 victims with detailed information of their names, places of death, and photos. Among them are 274 children, 322 women, and 81 victims were tortured to death by the Assad regime. And the number of massacres committed by the regime against unarmed civilians reached 14 massacres. Most of them took place in Damascus suburbs, and the killing was conducted at the rate of 121 victims per day. The victims were distributed over the provinces according to the following: Damascus suburbs 620, Aleppo 535, Homs 471, Idlib 468, Dar'a 362, Deir ez-Zur 357, Hama 354, Damascus 351, Latakia 43, Hasaka 22, Qunaitira 17, Al-Raqqa 8, Al-Suwaida 6, Tartus 1, and other nationalities 19.
The number of refugees that are running away from the regime's violations are increasing. However, as the numbers increase, their hardships also increase. We see more about the conditions of the refugees in the following report.
It's no longer strange for the regime that violated all codes of human rights with its killing and destruction to displace its citizens to other countries and live miserably. The number of the refugees might have exceeded 1 million who went to neighboring countries, but the dilemma is not in the numbers, it's in their complicating and deteriorating living status. That's a combination of bad health, social and even legal manners. The United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees in Jordan, Andrew Harper, said that the number of Syrian refugees registered with the UNHCR in Jordan reached 35,000, which is still a small percentage of the total number of Syrians in Jordan, which according to authorities exceeded 140,000. And Andrew said that nearly 600 Syrian refugees are crossing the border every day. Andrew emphasized that Al-Zaatari camp that was held by the Jordanian government to house the refugees will be equipped with all the retail basic needs. He added that the Syrian refugees in the camp are not complaining about the services provided to them, but from the camp side, especially that it's in a hot desert area where there is a lot of dust. The case is similar in Turkey, whereas in Lebanon and Iraq, the situation is more difficult for the Syrian refugees, who are suffering a lot of serious harassments, where in most cases it reaches to constant prosecutions. The situation is more drastic in Algeria, where even though the government there allowed the Syrians to enter the country, they left them without any government care and without providing them with any governmental shelters, where the Syrian refugees took streets and public parks as a place for them to stay, sleep and eat. A number of Algerians began a campaign to provide accommodation, clothing and food, such as this young man who is ensuring the preparation of breakfast for 200 Syrian refugees living in the squares adjacent to his restaurant. The refugees, like the rebels in Syria, are still resilient and insistent on their revolution, especially Orfa refugee camp in Turkey, where the citizens are insistent on their word that they will go back home sooner or later.
And finally, in Deir ez-Zor, where the villages of Al-Husseiniya, Al-Husan and Safirat Al-Tahtani witnessed heavy shelling and presence of MiG planes that were flying over the towns. Meanwhile, many were injured due to the bombing that targeted the city of Abu Kamal and Al-Mayadin amid heavy clashes that took place near the military security center, which led to the displacement of many citizens. And before we wrap up, here is another look at today's top stories.
مجزرة في مدينة جسرين. الله أكبر.
Over 166 died in Syria today, and the regime forces commit massacres in Damascus, Aleppo, and Homs. A new military formation called the People's Resistance Group is formed, and the Freedom Army takes over Deir ez-Zor. The Medical Committee of Damascus demands the halt of execution of Abdel Qadir al-Jazairi, and activists demand to free the journalist Mazen Darwish. With this, we end our news bulletin from Orient TV. For more updates about the Syrian revolution, please visit our Facebook page. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.